On a rain-dried Tuesday afternoon in March of 1970, at a 2 2/3 mile speedway east of Birmingham, Alabama, a driver named Buddy Baker climbed into a bright orange stock car after a morning spent skeet shooting, expecting to be done for the day, and headed to a fishing hole when Chrysler's engineers asked him for a few more laps. And on his 30th trip around the track, he pushed a 2-ton production-based automobile to 200.447 miles an hour. The first time in history, a stock car had officially broken 200 on a closed course. And here is the detail that should stop you cold. The car under him wasn't a purpose-built race prototype hiding behind a fake serial number. It was, underneath the paint, essentially the same car a dealer in Ohio would sell you, with a wing on the back and a cone on the nose. And within 12 months, the sanctioning body that had just watched it make history would rewrite its own rulebook specifically to make sure nothing like it ever raced competitively again. So ask the obvious question, the one that's been asked in garages and forum threads for over 50 years. How does a stock car company build a car so good it forces the entire sport to change its laws around it, and then have that same car vanish almost overnight? Not with a bang, not with a crash, not with a scandal, but with a single paragraph of new technical regulations that never even mentioned its name? Because the real story here isn't really about a wing or a cone or a top speed number. It's about what happens when engineering gets so far ahead of the rules built to contain it that the rulebook itself becomes the only opponent left who can win. Rewind to the end of the 1968 season and understand the wound this whole story grows out of, because it's a wound to pride, not to physics. Richard Petty, the biggest name in stock car racing, had just won 27 of 49 races, driving a Plymouth for Chrysler. And heading into 1969, he did something that sent a shockwave through Highland Park. He left. He walked away from Plymouth and drove a Ford Torino Talladega instead, because Ford's new aerodynamic fastback body was demonstrably faster on the big superspeedways, and Chrysler's engineers were left staring at the humiliating reality that the winningest driver in the sport no longer trusted their cars to win with. That is the real origin of everything that follows. Not a marketing plan, not a 5-year strategy, but a wounded corporation deciding it would rather rebuild the laws of aerodynamics than watch its own driver race for somebody else. Chrysler's engineers, led by a program manager named Larry Rathgeb, went back to the wind tunnel with something close to desperation. And their first attempt, a semi-fastback called the Charger 500, wasn't enough. Ford's cars were still faster, so they went further, grafting an 18-inch wedge-shaped steel nose cone onto the front of a Dodge Charger and a towering adjustable rear wing onto the back, smoothing the flush rear window to cut drag, and building a shape that looked, to anyone standing in a 1969 dealership parking lot, like something that had wandered off a NASA test track. They called it the Charger Daytona. Its competition debut, in September of 1969, at the brand-new Talladega Superspeedway, was chaos before it ever reached the green flag. The track's high banking generated speeds so extreme that tires were failing in practice, and most of the sport's biggest names, including Petty himself, boycotted the race in protest over safety, which meant the Daytona's first-ever race win went not to a superstar, but to a relatively unknown driver named Richard Brickhouse, thrown into the seat almost by circumstance, in a car so far ahead of its rivals that it barely mattered who was driving it. And that's the moment to hold on to, because it's the quiet warning shot before the real detonation. A wing car had just won its debut race with a substitute driver at the wheel, and nobody at NASCAR headquarters yet understood what that actually meant for the coming season. Through 1970, it stopped being a warning and became a rout. Bobby Isaac drove a Daytona to the NASCAR championship that year with 11 wins, 13 pole positions, and a qualifying lap of nearly 200 miles an hour. Plymouth, watching its sister brand's success, rushed out its own version built on the Roadrunner body, called the Superbird, with Richard Petty, lured back to Plymouth for exactly this car, behind the wheel of one of them, and a young driver named Pete Hamilton, winning the Daytona 500 outright in a Petty Enterprises Superbird before the season even really got going. By the time the year was finished, Dodge Daytonas and Plymouth Superbirds together had won 33 of 48 NASCAR Grand National races. An absolute stranglehold on a sport that is supposed to have a dozen credible contenders on any given Sunday. And it was in the middle of that dominance, that March afternoon at Talladega, that Buddy Baker put the exclamation point on the whole story by breaking 200 miles an hour in front of NASCAR's own official timers. You would think a manufacturer achieving that level of engineering supremacy would be celebrated as the pinnacle of the sport. Instead, it became the problem the sport had to solve, because a stock car series only works if the racing is competitive, and a field where 23 of the 40 cars at the Daytona 500 were essentially the same winged Chrysler product isn't a competition anymore. It's a coronation. And Bill France Sr., the man who had founded NASCAR and still ran it like a fiefdom, understood that a sport built on the thrill of uncertain outcomes cannot survive very many seasons of certain ones. So for 1971, NASCAR didn't ban the wing cars. Read that again, because this is the detail almost every retelling of this story gets slightly wrong. The detail that actually makes the story more interesting than the simple version. NASCAR never once, in an official document, stated that the Dodge Charger Daytona or the Plymouth Superbird were prohibited from racing. What it did instead was quietly, surgically change the engine rules. Any car using that aerodynamic bodywork would now be limited to a maximum engine displacement of 305 cubic inches, a number that sounds arbitrary until you realize the Daytona and Superbird had been racing with 426 and 440 cubic inch engines, meaning the new rule didn't outlaw the shape, it simply starved it, forcing the winged cars to either carry an engine roughly a third smaller than what had made them dominant, or accept a punishing weight penalty if they wanted to keep the bigger motor. Either way, guaranteeing they would be uncompetitive against conventional bodies running full-sized engines. On paper, the wing cars remained perfectly legal. In practice, Chrysler understood immediately what had actually happened, and by the start of the 1971 season, it had already walked away from the program entirely. No new Superbirds, no factory-backed Daytonas. The whole extraordinary aerodynamic arms race simply switched off at the source. And here's the honest complication, the part that keeps this from being a clean underdog crushed by the establishment story. Because at the 1971 Daytona 500, a lone independent driver named Richard Brooks showed up with a Charger Daytona built to the new 305 cubic inch rule. And for a handful of laps, several times over the course of the race, he actually led it. A supposedly gutted, rule-strangled winged car, running at the front of the biggest race in the sport, before a collision involving another car set him back to a 7th-place finish. So the wing cars were never technically banned. One of them nearly won the very race that was supposed to prove they couldn't compete anymore. And the sport, that had rewritten its own rulebook to stop them, still had to watch. One last time, as the shape it feared came within a handful of laps of embarrassing the entire plan. That race, the 1971 Daytona 500, was the final time a winged aero car would ever appear on a NASCAR track, and Richard Petty, driving a conventional Plymouth Roadrunner, no wing, no nose cone, won it, which is its own small irony, since Petty had once left the brand entirely because its cars weren't fast enough. And now, here he was, winning in the very car body that had replaced the wing car he might have driven instead. And there's a second irony sitting underneath all of this that most retellings skip entirely. Because for all the drama of NASCAR legislating this car off the track, the Superbird was, at the exact same moment, quietly failing in an arena nobody could rig the rules for: the American showroom. Chrysler had been required, under NASCAR's homologation rules, to build one street-legal Superbird for roughly every 2 Plymouth dealers in the country, which forced them to produce nearly 1,900 road-going versions of a car, whose enormous nose cone and towering rear wing made it almost comically